I mean, Putin has always had a very strong sense of security and his own personal security. And that goes obviously right back to his days as a KGB man. More recently, of course, he's seen what's happened to some of, in this case, America's enemies, in which were both the assassination of the Iranian leadership in the first day of the attacks between Israel and America against that, but also the removal of President Maduro. So he's got a very high concern that something similar could happen to him, particularly drone attacks, because what's happening recently over the last 5 or 6 months is that the Ukrainians have been able to extend the range of some of their drones. In fact, they're almost now like cruise missiles with a significant range. So areas which were previously difficult for the Ukrainians to get at, they now can get at themselves. And this is not using Western technology, either the Attackers missile or what they're after, the German Taurus missiles. And so Putin has a very strong sense of his own security and recognises now the Ukrainians can get him. And of course, if you recall, right back at the beginning of the whole campaign, there were several attempts by Russian agents to try and assassinate President Zelensky. So I think what the Ukrainians do are kind of returning the favour to him. The other paranoia of it obviously was most obvious recently on May the 9th, on the standard sort of May Day parade, when the Ukrainians effectively gave permission to the Russians to hold their parade and threatened enormous consequences if the Ukrainians then tried to break up that particular parade. So I think Putin now, and we've seen it with the missile defences around his palaces, the reports of netting being put up over the palaces as anti-drone netting, he's seriously concerned about his own security. We've also seen evidence of in terms of Putin's concern with security, that he's installed anti-drone nets over some of the lorry and car parks close to his palaces. I think this shows him what the main threat is. We know that the wiring over various protected areas can be effective, but I think it shows you that he's not leaving any chances whatsoever in terms of what's going on. And this, of course, went down to his security guards, because they don't want to be the man who's in charge when Putin gets assassinated. So they'll be thinking every single way they can to protect their leader, and covering over major lorry or car parks close to one of his palaces is an obvious way to try and do that. The Spider-Web was an extraordinary event because it combined both a high level of intelligence and forward planning with a very imaginative use of drones. And elements of the Spider-Web actually conducted attacks against really high-profile Russian equipment, literally in the Far East, almost as far over as the Kamchatka Peninsula. So that's a massive, massive difference. It showed the extent to which Russia was able to be penetrated by Ukrainian intelligence, and also the ability of the Ukrainian intelligence themselves to put together a very sophisticated operation involving high quality drones, really well targeted, and then, as I said, a clear understanding of where Russia had its weaknesses, and that's why I think it's so important and so such a good example, and therefore such a threat to President Putin. President Putin recognises that he himself is a target. He's also the man who's probably doing most to actually stop an honest conversation with the Ukrainians about what's going forward. And there is evidence already that there are elements within what you might call his kleptocracy, the people who surround him, those who support him, are looking for some kind of peaceful solution. But for him, he can't get that because he promised the Russian people, his great shtick to the Russian people is that he's going to make them great again. And the starting point, the first dish on that move towards greatness, was going to be Ukraine, which he significantly, signalling, failed to deliver. And so I think he recognises that the kind of standard support he's had in the past is at least questioned. I don't think he's yet worried about, particularly about a coup, but it's at least being questioned. And so at a particular point, that people might then look to alternatives to come to the fore. And so he can't walk away from what's going on in Ukraine because he can't really declare any kind of victory. If he thought he had a victory, he could walk away from it, and then he might be less paranoid. But he's got himself in a cleft stick situation. He can't win in Ukraine, but he can't afford to walk away from it either. And so he is stuck. And I think in that particular position, he is very vulnerable, and therefore sees himself potentially as a target for assassination, and just down the line, potentially a sort of internal coup against him as well. The other thing the Ukrainians have been doing over time, and this will actually add to Putin's paranoia, is that they've been gradually eliminating senior Russian generals. The most recent general to be assassinated is a man called Davidov, who appears to his main interest seems to be on a logistics side. Now, logistics is obviously key to what's going on in terms of the fight from there. But again, I think it also shows the reach of the Ukrainian intelligence. It was a very well-planned attack in terms of both the targeting itself of the vehicle and also when the actual assassination took place. And again, it's an indicator of the extent to which Ukrainian intelligence both can penetrate and utilize other agents inside Russia. Again, it will add to the general paranoia of the Russian general staff and indeed Putin himself. So the other thing that's been going on is these attacks recently onto the port of Mariupol, which sits to the east of Ukraine itself. This is a significant development, but it goes along with the other things that the Ukrainians have been able to do in terms of denying logistics, Putin's logistics into the area. So this is a major closure report and will force the Russians to hold even more of their resources much further east, which makes it harder for them down the line to generate the forces they need to conduct attacks. It's a really significant strike on a major logistic facility and goes with some of the other strikes that have been going on across the Crimean Peninsula as well, all of which have the same net effect of making it much harder for the Russians to be able to develop an attack in the future. One question that arises is where does this leave the overall picture in terms of between Russia and Ukraine? I mean, Ukraine at the moment, certainly on the tactical level, on the battlefield itself, has got the advantage in fighting the Russians. I mean, there has been this sort of dynamic of development, reaction to development, which has been a continuous development throughout the entire war. But we've now reached a stage where overall, on the battlefield, on the tactical battlefield, Ukraine seems to have the advantage in terms of the use of drones, and they've created this kind of death zone from there. They've also, in the last few months, been able to go beyond that, and they're now able to strike targets much deeper inside Russia, 500 to 600 kilometers inside Russia, which is starting to affect the Russians' ability to produce logistics, supply, and to communicate. And this is really significant. But there is an issue about where this could go. Does Ukraine have the capability, the resources, and the technology to turn this sort of tactical advantage on the battlefield, which they undoubtedly have at the moment, into a major operational breakthrough? And I think that is slightly more questionable, not because they haven't got the skill or the tenacity or the bravery or anything like that. It's simply the resources required to attack. Because the challenges that the Russians have had of trying to get through this death zone would also apply to the Ukrainians themselves if they tried to actually advance through that 30 kilometers of death zone as well. So there are challenges at the moment. Ukraine certainly has an advantage at the moment on the battlefield, and it seems to be exploiting that extremely well. But whether they can turn it into an operational advantage, I think, is still slightly more questionable. Putin must be now thinking about where he sits in terms of this overall campaign. He can also read the runes, and his competent generals will tell him it's going to be very hard to make an operational breakthrough where they currently are. He's also aware of the strategic big picture, which, despite the recent relief because of the partial lifting of sanctions against Russian oil, his economy is now fully dedicated to war. And the net result of that is other things that he might want to do are hard to do. And there'll come a point where, again, the economic pressure will start to build on President Putin. And he may find himself forced to try to come to the kind of ceasefire table and have a conversation about that. He's not there yet, and the challenge with anything to do with either economic warfare or even sanctions, and they do have an effect, and they are not ineffective, but the way they work tends to be longer term rather than short term, and he can probably afford to hold on, certainly for this summer and maybe early into next year as well. So the pressure is on him. There's no question about it. This is not a good place for the Russian economy to be. But whether the pressure will then turn into something more dramatic and force him to cause a ceasefire, he's not quite there yet. It may happen towards the end of this year or next year. But analysts like myself have been expecting that to happen for a number of years. But his tolerance for the pain of the Russian people is extremely high. In other words, he doesn't really care. How long he can keep that going for is perhaps more moot.